Well, I guess we're back again, and for this particular segment, I would like to talk very briefly about the definition of culture. Once again, Fagan does define culture in that major first chapter when we look at different types of concepts that we need to share for the particular book that we're using. Fagan always does a nice job, but one of the approaches, if you remember from reading in the syllabus, one of the approaches that we're taking here is that culture is a system. We are using that particular perspective to assist us in understanding how cultures work, and in particular how cultures change. Because the bottom line is that we're looking at some 20,000 years plus of human cultural change. And so we need to know something about why cultures change. And of course we know that cultures change because people invent things all of the time. Cultures change because they borrow from each other, borrow items, borrow ideas, or they can borrow. Cultures change because they are constantly being reinterpreted by those people who are learning a culture anew. How you do something may be very different from how your parents or grandparents do that same particular thing. The result may be very much the same, but maybe the road to that destination may vary a little bit. So if you're making a spear point, for example, you're learning how to make it, your father is teaching you. His particular approach might be somewhat different from the approach that you end up implementing from his teachings, and so that may produce what we recognize as a form of cultural change, whether it's particularly important or not. So what I'd like for us to do is to at least recognize the possibility that culture is not just a list of characteristics. In fact, if we were to just list characteristics for cultures, we would have wonderful long lists, but we would find that we wouldn't have any information with which to understand how cultures work, because cultures are dynamic. They're constantly in the process of change, in the process of being alive and working and staying alive. And indeed, so much of archaeology in the past had to do with making lists or memorizing lists of artifacts, or taking a particular time period and identifying it based upon an arrow point. It's like trying to understand industrialized American culture, if there is such a thing, and trying to identify it by one particular characteristic. What would that characteristic be? Should it be at the refrigerator? Should it be at the computer? But yet we know that these are found in other parts of the world, and these are tools that are used in other cultural circumstances as well. And yet think about it, when we have reduced in the past a culture to the shape of a spear point or an arrow point and focused upon that and not how people tried to survive, how they interacted with each other, not on human behavior, what did we do? We diminished those cultures dramatically into one particular object. It's an approach that I find to be offensive no matter where we find it in the world. Cultures are something that people are involved in. They're part of human behavior. And so it is humans that, archaeology may be the systematic study from the past, from the remains of human behavior, given certain specified objectives. But the bottom line, it is about human behavior. We only study things in order to understand the people behind those particular things, the people who manufactured or used those particular things. And it is the people that make the archaeology in the past exciting. So I think we need a more exciting definition. And that definition, which allows us to explain how cultures work, how cultures adapt, how cultures interact with their systems. That particular approach is one that we can find in systems theory. And so what we can say is that culture, this is just one particular point of view, but I find that it is a useful point of view. Culture is a system. I like that, because what is a system? A system is a whole composed of interacting, functionally interrelated parts. A whole composed of interacting, functionally interrelated parts is a system, which means that if we say culture is a system, that we're also saying that culture is a whole composed of interacting, functionally interrelated parts. We can also say that culture is an open system. An open system is a system in constant interaction with its environments. And in this case, we're talking about the physical environment, which is an obvious one for us, but also the social environment, which can have as profound an impact on a culture as the natural environment can. And certainly this is something that we see today. It's very much a part of our conversation of global warming, is how culture and environmental systems interact together to change the nature of our environment, which impacts various aspects of our culture and so on. I think you get the idea. So we're talking about the parts of a culture, technological, sociological, ideological, and you're going to find that the book doesn't just focus on particular tools, but it talks about where those tools might have worked, how getting the materials for those, raw materials for those tools might have been part of social cycles of movements of people, trade networks, how all of this may have somehow interrelated with what people believe about themselves, about their neighbors, about natures. So the bottom line here is I like this particular approach because it is an approach that shows us that everything is interconnected, that all of human behavior is somehow connected to itself, and to the environments in which it's found. And this is an approach that we're going to be using throughout this course. So think about it as culture, a complex set of interrelationships. Okay? Culture is a system. So let's see if we have anything else here. I think I've pretty much discussed everything that is part of this. And so when you look at this particular book and you expect to see a list of artifacts, because maybe that is something that you have studied, where clearly it was the Clovis points that defined early man, and then you discover, well, that maybe early man in the Americas didn't always use Clovis points, and maybe what was more important was what kinds of tools were people using to stay alive, and what were they getting with those, hunting or not hunting or scavenging with those particular tools. How were they relating to each other? Maybe all of that is more important. And so that is indeed what we're going to be covering. So let's see if this particular part of the experiment worked. And in the meantime, I wish you a very good evening, and I'll be back shortly, I hope. Take care.